Hey guys, so we left off in chapter 12. We had talked about various bacteria and viruses that cause foodborne illness, and we left off talking about parasites that can cause foodborne illness. So there's two major types of parasites we're going to talk about: protists, which are single-celled parasites, and helminths, which are parasitic worms. So the two types of protists that can cause foodborne illness, or really waterborne illness, are Cryptosporidium and Giardia. They're fairly uncommon. You don't really find them in water supply in cities that treat their water systems, or even if you have your well water or something, you would have it tested for these things. Most people become sick with Cryptosporidium and Giardia either A, if they're out hiking and they decide to drink water from like a stagnant pond or something that's contaminated with these guys, or if they are traveling in developing countries and they drink the local water, which is not treated the way that U.S. and developed countries treat their water. So the Cryptosporidium and Giardia get into the water system from animals that are contaminated or infected, like wild animals and domesticated animals can become infected as well. So not something you probably need to be concerned about because they're not in your drinking water supply. Though there was one exception to this, and that was in 1993. There was a big Cryptosporidium outbreak in Milwaukee when a water treatment plant there got contaminated, and hundreds of thousands of people in the city became ill with Cryptosporidium, and a lot of people died, actually, people who were immunocompromised. It took a big hit on the AIDS population in Milwaukee at the time. But otherwise, the moral is don't drink stagnant water when you're out for a hike. And also be careful about the water you consume when you're traveling abroad. And that includes tap water, but also any type of drink that might contain ice cubes that are made with tap water, and also consuming produce or salads that where the produce may have been washed with tap water. All of those could be potential sources of contamination, so protect yourself from traveler's diarrhea. Um, a, a type of helminth or worm that's a parasite is tapeworms. So there's lots of different worm parasites. Most of them are very uncommon in the United States. Even tapeworms are extremely uncommon, but they are still around. So it's one that's worth mentioning. And it has a cool dual host life cycle that I thought I'd inform you about. So tapeworms have to go through two hosts. They have to go through a human and they have to go through either a cow or a pig, depending on the type of tapeworm, in order to fully mature from an egg to an adult tapeworm. So they have to go through both of these hosts. So an infected adult human or infected human will shed these eggs into the environment, and cows or pigs can eat those eggs. And upon ingesting, the eggs will hatch in the intestines of the pig or the cow, and they'll burrow out into the muscle tissue of the cow or the pig, and they'll form these little cysts in the muscle tissue. If you freeze the meat or cook the meat to appropriate temperatures, you will kill these cysts. So the only way humans become infected is when they eat relatively fresh meat that has not been cooked properly. So consuming undercooked infected tapeworm meat so a human ingests the muscle meat that contains these cysts. The cysts hatch in the intestines of the human and they grow to an adult tapeworm. So it looks like a long piece of tape. They're long, flat worms, and they're segmented, and each of those segments is actually a reproductive unit. So the last segment breaks off and is essentially a tapeworm egg. And so this cycle continues, and that's how tapeworms grow in your intestines. Now, some of the symptoms of a tapeworm infection can include anemia, intestinal bleeding, weight loss, nutrient deficiency, some pretty uncomfortable stuff. But you can have tapeworm infections for several years. They can live for a very long time in your intestines if you don't get diagnosed. And one of the major dangers of a prolonged tapeworm infection is that you can reinfect yourself with tapeworms by consuming the eggs, by eating the eggs, by not properly washing your hands after going to the bathroom. You can contaminate yourself. And if you eat tapeworm eggs, they will hatch in your intestines and try to burrow their way into your muscles. But because you are not a cow or a pig, they can get lost along the way and end up in your brain. This is a brain scan image of a person who has what is called neurocysticercosis, which is basically tapeworm cysts in their brain. So you don't want to get tapeworms, is the moral of that story. Fungi are another organism that could potentially cause foodborne illness, but rarely do, namely because they're highly visible on foods and they look gross, and so we don't typically consume foods that contain fungi because they're visible and we won't eat them. Another type of fungi that can cause foodborne illness are mushrooms. Mushrooms are food, but they are also technically, they can also be very toxic. Certain mushrooms produce very potent toxins, so don't go hunting for mushrooms on your own unless you know what you're doing. Another fun fact about fungi is that they are actually the source of the first antibiotic, which is penicillin. It was derived originally from a blue-green mold that actually grows on cantaloupes. So I guess I'm not saying if you have a bacterial infection you should go eat a moldy cantaloupe, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that fungi on food are probably more likely to treat foodborne illness than they are to cause foodborne illness. The last type of foodborne illness that's caused by a sort of an organism is prion disease. So the disease that's caused by prions is mad cow disease. And it's called mad cow disease because these prions develop in their brain tissue and basically turn their brain tissue into little holy sponges and make them go mad or crazy. They start losing their mind. So mad cow disease, prion disease, is actually very similar to Alzheimer's disease, and actually Alzheimer's disease is actually a form of prion disease, but it's separate from mad cow disease, not to confuse you there. So what is a prion exactly? Well, I like to call prions zombie proteins because what a prion is it's a protein. So these are some normal proteins pictured here, okay? And what happens is something causes them to mutate and become mutant proteins or prions. And the thing that causes cow proteins to mutate into prions is cows eating other cows' brain material, which sounds gross and unethical, and it is now, but in the 70s and 80s and early 90s in the UK, this was standard practice that cow feed contained scrap body parts from slaughtered cows, including brain material. And cows that ate brain material often developed mad cow disease because for some reason eating brains causes your proteins to convert into prions. So these prions, the reason I call them zombie proteins is that zombies are like normal people that die and then they come back and they're zombies and they go around and they try to convert other normal living people into zombies. So that's what prions do. They go around converting normal proteins into prion zombies like themselves. So after a while you have a whole bunch of these prions. These normal proteins have all converted into prions. These prions will congregate together and cause cell death of the brain tissue. So this process, this whole process of prions mutating and then converting other proteins to become prions is very long and slow, which is why this disease, mad cow disease, takes a very long time to develop. The problem is that prion disease is contagious from cow, or not contagious, but you can get mad cow disease from eating meat from a cow that had mad cow disease. So it's called something different in humans. It's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, but don't worry about that. And unfortunately, unlike bacteria and viruses and parasites, which you can kill by cooking your food properly, you can't kill prions. They're not destroyable by heat. And that's not a real word, destroyable, but I just made it up. So you can't kill prions with heat. So any cows that had mad cow disease, they had to be destroyed entirely. You couldn't use that meat for anything. So it's no longer a good feeding practice to feed animals brain parts from other animals, and so hopefully we won't have any more prion disease in our food system. And hopefully you didn't consume any beef in the UK in the 80s or 90s. So how can we prevent foodborne illness? So there's some tips for that in this slide and the next couple of slides. So the first thing we can do is be careful about the food we purchase. There's a lot of tips in your book, but I've highlighted a few of them here. First, pay attention to best by dates on your food, particularly on dairy and meat products. The longer you let it sit out, the more likely it is to spoil and have potential to cause illness. So try to use them before the best by date. Don't buy food that's in damaged containers. If they're damaged, they could have been contaminated with bacteria. Purchase only pasteurized milk and juice. Unpasteurized milk and juice can contain harmful bacteria that's particularly dangerous for young children, pregnant women, and elderly people, and people who are immunocompromised. So if you do happen to buy milk or juice that's unpasteurized, there's actually a mandate stating that it has to have a warning label stating that it might contain harmful bacteria. So if you are feeding any of these people in these populations, try to buy pasteurized only. And then, of course, pack raw meat separately when you go grocery shopping. Don't pack your raw meat in the same bag as your produce, where it could leak all over your produce and drip salmonella and E. coli everywhere. When you get to your kitchen, when you get home with your groceries, some tips you can follow to prevent foodborne illness are called the Fight Back Tips by the FDA. Clean, separate, cook, and chill. So the first one is clean. Wash your hands, wash your cooking surfaces and dishes, etc. Soap and water is perfectly fine and sufficient, and actually the best way to do it. The next tip is to separate, and that is to prevent cross-contamination from raw meats and raw produce. So you really don't want your raw produce to come into contact with raw meat juices. The best thing to do is to use separate cutting boards or utensils entirely when preparing food. Or if you only have like one cutting board or cutting surface, either cut your produce first and then do the raw meat last, or cut your raw meat and then clean the surface, go back and clean the surface well. But don't cross-contaminate. Don't cut raw meat on one surface, throw it in the oven, and then cut all your vegetables for your salad on that same surface, because then you could contaminate your salad. The next tip is to cook your food properly, to proper temperatures, and the proper cooking temperatures for different types of meat are listed in your book. You don't have to memorize them. And this is important for killing bacteria that could be contaminating your meat. Let's take a look at two different cuts of meat, though. So consider a steak, like a thick cut of steak, which is just a solid cut of muscle tissue from a cow, and then consider a ground beef patty that you would use to make a hamburger. Okay, the steak is a solid cut of meat. The only contamination, bacterial contamination, should be on the surface, which has been handled. Whereas in a ground beef patty, that ground beef has surface area all over. That ground beef has been ground in a machine and patted together with somebody's hands. So there could be bacteria on the inside, on the outside, all over that patty, both inside and out. So if you are someone who likes your meat somewhat undercooked, you're probably safer with an undercooked steak than you are with an undercooked burger, just because there's more potential for more contamination of ground beef. Okay, so the last tip is to chill your food, and this is mostly referring to leftovers. So, I mean, it's also a good idea to freeze food, like maybe if you buy meat, you're not going to use it right away, freeze it. It'll keep longer. But if you're talking about leftovers and food safety with leftovers, you should chill it as quickly as possible. So the rule for chilling your food, your leftovers, is 2 hours, 2 inches, 4 days. In other words, you should try to refrigerate your leftovers within 2 hours of having served the food. So don't make dinner at 6 o'clock at night and then leave the leftovers out on the stove while you watch all your primetime TV and then put it away at midnight when you go to bed. You should really put it away within 2 hours after having made it. Then you should store it ideally in a shallow container that's no deeper than 2 inches. This allows the food to cool more quickly and more completely to minimize any bacterial growth. And then you should throw it out after 4 days, which is a very conservative estimate. I don't know about you, but I keep food for probably more like a week. But probably should throw it away after 4 days. It's a safe rule. So there's a lot of techniques that can be used to preserve our food, to make it last longer, to keep it from spoiling. Some of these are very age-old procedures, things that involve drying foods, like smoking or drying or dehydrating foods, like turning meat into jerkies or doing dried fruits. All right, these are techniques that remove moisture and water from food. Bacteria and molds need moisture to grow, so they can't grow well on dried foods. So you can make meat and fruit last a lot longer by drying them. Another technique that helps to prevent bacterial growth through a similar method is adding salt or sugar to preserve a food. Bacteria, they need moisture, and if they grow in an environment where there's a lot of salt or sugar, that salt and sugar can draw moisture out of their cells. So they can't really grow well in those environments. So adding salt is a popular way to help preserve meat. You go to the grocery store, look at a package of meat at the nutrition facts panel. It's relatively high in sodium, again, because salt is a great preservative. Sugar is typically used as a preservative for fruits. Fruit preserves, jellies, jams have a lot of sugar to prevent spoilage of fruit in that case. Curing is a technique that uses both salt and sugar to preserve food. Let's see some other ones here. Chilling and freezing, another pretty ancient technique. People have always recognized that food that stays colder spoils more slowly. So this is because chilling foods slows down bacterial growth, and freezing foods will actually stop bacterial growth. It won't kill bacteria, but it will stop them from growing while they are frozen. When you thaw them, the bacteria can start growing again. So the cooler they are, the slower the bacteria grow, and the slower the food actually spoils. So even before we had refrigerators and freezers, people had ice blocks, or they had like a cellar or something underground that was cooler than the rest of the house, where they would store some of their food to keep it from spoiling. The opposite technique, heating food, like cooking it or pasteurizing it, can also be a great way to preserve it or prevent it from spoiling, prevent microbial growth. Pasteurization is a process that's actually named after Louis Pasteur, the father of microbiology, who invented the process to save the wine industry in France in the late 1800s. So he recognized that all these vintners were coming to him with spoiled wine, and he recognized that it was spoiled by bacteria, and by treating the wine, by heating it very briefly before adding the yeast, they could prevent their wines from spoiling. So he gets that eponymous name of pasteurization. The last technique, I guess, that I will talk about is irradiation, which is a form of sterilizing food by treating it with radioactivity. It does not make your food radioactive, it just kills bacteria or living organisms that might spoil the food. Other things that can affect food safety are food additives, which are things that are added to foods to make them more appealing to consumers. So food additives can be natural or they can be synthetic chemicals. They're not all bad. So an example I have is food coloring. So if you want to color your food more red, one way you could do that is to use a synthetic chemical like red dye number 40, or you could use natural red dyes or juices, like beet juice is a common natural coloring agent. Okay, so food additives aren't necessarily unnatural or synthetic. They can be, but there's also natural forms of food additives, and they're not just added to color your food. They could be added for flavoring or texture, or to add nutrients. If you're adding vitamin C or vitamin A to a food, that's considered a food additive. So there's lots of reasons for adding different chemicals to our foods to enhance them. Food additive safety. The safety of food additives was determined by the Food Additives Amendment back in, I think it was the 1970s. And basically any food additives that were in use when this amendment was passed were sort of grandfathered in and decided they were generally recognized as safe, or GRAS. That they didn't need to be proven to be safe because they'd been in use for so long that it was just assumed that they were safe. Now, any new additives that have been introduced since then have to be proven to be safe before we can use them. So there is some concern that there are some of those food additives that were sort of grandfathered in and generally recognized as safe weren't actually proven to be safe and may not be as safe as we think they are. There are some food additives that they just haven't been studied well enough to know if they really are as safe as we think they are. So that's an area of contention certainly in nutrition, whether or not food additives really are as safe as we think they are. Another area of contention in food safety is genetic modification. So before I talk about genetic modification of food crops, I want to talk a little bit about what genetic modification is. So it's a process of changing an organism's DNA. And we've actually been doing it since the dawn of agriculture, when humans first started growing wheat and crops. And we did it in a very slow process known as selective breeding, basically taking two strains of a crop that had traits that we liked and crossbreeding them until we got a whole new crop. So the original wheat that was, you know, existed when our ancestors first started agriculture was very different than the wheat we have now, not because we have genetically engineered it in a lab, but because we genetically engineered it in the field by selectively breeding these plants, these crops. We've also done it with domesticated animals, both pets and food animals. So it's a very slow process because it requires us to wait for generations of animals to be born and grow up and breed them. Whereas in more current years, we've developed the technology or the biotechnology to manipulate genetic material in a dish, in a seed, in order to get the traits we want in our agriculture in a faster time period. Okay, so genetic engineering is used in agriculture, but it's also used in other areas of science and has some really valuable applications. So one area where it's been used really successfully is in medicine. And the example that I want to give to you is about insulin. So insulin is important for glucose regulation. It's important for people who have type 1 diabetes. And it used to be that people who had this condition, before we were able to do genetic engineering, people who had type 1 diabetes had to get their insulin from pigs. People had, pharmaceutical industry would raise pigs, bleed them, and extract their insulin and sell that to people who had diabetes. And it was very expensive because it was very time consuming and it was hard to get a lot of insulin from a few pigs. And also it was pig insulin, it wasn't human insulin, so it had a lot of side effects. It was expensive and it had a lot of side effects. So not the greatest therapy for people with diabetes. Since we were able to genetically engineer bacteria to produce human insulin, it is now much cheaper to obtain insulin, so a lot more people have access to it and can afford it, and it has a lot fewer side effects because it's actually human insulin and not pig insulin. So really just one example of how it's revolutionized certain areas of medicine. It's also becoming a really hot topic in industrial production of biofuels, engineering bacteria to produce various biofuels. And of course, it's also used in agriculture to enhance our food crops. So there's a lot of pros and cons to modifying foods. So one thing that we can do with genetically modifying food crops is that we can enhance the taste and even the nutrient quality of certain foods. So the example I'll give you here is something called golden rice, which is a strain of rice that's been engineered to produce beta-carotene, which is an orange plant pigment, hence the name golden rice. And beta-carotene is really a form of vitamin A, which is an important vitamin that is globally, there's a lot of nutrient deficiency of vitamin A, particularly in countries where rice is a staple crop. And so by genetically engineering rice that is high in vitamin A, it's a proposed solution for vitamin A deficiency in those underdeveloped countries. So it really can be used as a good thing to enhance nutrient quality of food. It can also be used to enhance crop yields, to make crops grow faster or make them resistant to certain pesticides, like we saw with Roundup Ready corn and soy in Food Inc. Genetically engineering foods to have increased yields can also help us to solve food security problems globally. If we make more crops, we can potentially provide them to countries where they don't have enough food. So those are some of the benefits of GMOs. Some of the concerns are things like gene transfer, that some of these genetically engineered genes that are added to the crops could be transferred to our gut bacteria or bacteria in nature or to other plants through cross-pollination, and that this could result in some problems. Another concern is that there would be this lack of biodiversity, that we would no longer have a bunch of different types of soybean plants out there with different genetics. Instead, we have all these clones of the same, genetically same soy, which makes them very vulnerable to disease if they're all genetically identical. Another real concern is an increased risk of allergies. So it depends on the type of gene that's engineered into these plants. If you're engineering something like beta-carotene into rice, it's unlikely to have any health issues or allergic risks, because beta-carotene is a nutrient that's found in a lot of foods. It's not a foreign protein. But crops that contain foreign proteins may increase the risk of allergies. Also, another concern that's not health related but more economically related is that a lot of these GMO crops are patented now, and so it gives certain companies ownership over the entire crop industry, and they start to control our food system, which I think is dangerous from a philosophical or economical standpoint, less so from a health standpoint. And on that same note, consumers really want to know what's in their food, and currently GMOs are not labeled, and that's concerning to a lot of people who are concerned about potential health issues. However, I must say that there is no compelling evidence to suggest that GMOs are worse for our health than non-GMO crops. But just the same, in the effort of honesty, it seems like that foods should be labeled with what they are. So some other things that can affect food safety are persistent organic pollutants that are found in food. Toxic metals like lead or mercury can contaminate water, and particularly mercury can be found in certain types of fish, namely large predatory fish, which concentrate mercury in water sources in their tissues. So people who are sensitive to mercury really have to watch out for certain types of fish consumption, like swordfish, shark. Pesticide residues can be found on fruits and vegetables that we consume. So if you're trying to reduce your pesticide intake, I've provided this list of the dirty dozen fruits and vegetables that tend to be highest in pesticides. Notice that a lot of these are fruits or vegetables where you actually eat the outside of the fruit. So that's where most of the pesticide is going to be, on the outside of the fruit. So apples, peppers, potatoes, blueberries, cucumbers, grapes. These are things that even if they have a peel, you still eat the peel of these fruits and vegetables. Also, another thing to note here is that a lot of these are small fruits that have high surface areas. So like blueberries, grapes, okay, they're very small, so there's a lot of surface area if you eat a handful of blueberries or grapes, a lot of surface area for potential pesticide coverage. Spinach, also a lot of surface area there. So it kind of helps you use a little bit of reasoning in the grocery store too about things that maybe you might choose to buy organic, because organic foods we'll talk about have less pesticides, not always no pesticides, but less pesticides. Or alternatively, you buy the non-organic version and you just wash them very well. These Clean 15 list here are foods that are considered lowest in pesticides. And notice a lot of them are fruits and vegetables that have a non-edible peel. So cantaloupe, grapefruit, mangoes, pineapples, watermelon, squash, all right, winter squash. We don't eat the peels of those fruits and vegetables, and most of the pesticide is going to be on the outside, on the peel. So we're just not consuming the pesticide on those. Some of the other ones to note, sweet potatoes and onions both grow underground, and pesticide is something that's sprayed on the surface of the plant, that's on the outside, so like the green part. So the onions and sweet potatoes are not really don't contain a lot of pesticide. So there you have it with pesticides. So another thing that can be a persistent organic pollutant are growth hormones and antibiotics that are found in slight amounts, residual amounts in meat and dairy products of animals that have been given antibiotics or hormones to enhance milk or meat production. Though I should mention that most milk nowadays is RBST or hormone free. A lot of dairy farmers listen to consumers who did not like growth hormones in their milk, and most of them don't inject growth hormones anymore. So if you're trying to reduce your intake of pesticides or hormones, you can choose to buy organic foods. There's no compelling evidence that consuming organic foods is any healthier for you than non-organic food consumption. People who eat organic just tend to be more health-oriented anyway and are choosing more fruits and vegetables. But if you're increasing fruits and vegetables in your diet, it probably matters less whether they're organic or not. But just the same, organic foods will have less pesticide. They can still be grown with some pesticides, but they have to be certain varieties, not toxic pesticides. They also can't use toxic fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers, or genetic engineering, or irradiation, or hormones or antibiotics. You can add that to the list. So if you're trying to shop organic, you want to look for this symbol here that says USDA Organic. That's a certification indicating that these foods are indeed grown without toxic fertilizers or pesticides or hormones or antibiotics. If a food says that it's made with organic ingredients, yes, some of the ingredients are organic, but the whole product is not organic. So just a little marketing game there to make you aware of. That you want to really look for this symbol if you're trying to consume organic foods. So the term organic farming and organic foods used to mean something different and more sort of holistic and pure than what it means today. It used to represent a philosophy of growing food naturally. And nowadays, the term for that is sustainable agriculture. Being able to grow food that is sustainable in the environment. So you can continue to grow food on the land. You don't deplete the land of nutrients. That the animals fertilize the land and then you harvest the land, etc. So organic doesn't always mean sustainable. There are plenty of mass producers of organic farming. Those chickens and cattle in the Food Inc., the living environments that they're in, could, if they're not given antibiotics and they're not given growth hormones, but they're in those same living environments, they can still qualify as organic. So if you're really about supporting a philosophy of sustainable agriculture, organic in the grocery store is not the way to go. Where you want to go to support sustainable agriculture is to farmers markets and family farms and CSAs, which is kind of like buying a share of a local farm, and then they deliver a basket to you like every week of fresh produce. Or start your own garden. If you don't have space on your property, you can buy a plot at a community garden, and a lot of communities have these where you just pay like a monthly rental fee and then you get to work the plot yourself. So in this class, we're going to focus a lot on nutrition problems in developed countries, which is where we all live. But it's good to take a moment to think about what nutrition means globally. And globally, undernutrition or malnutrition is actually of a big concern. So if you look at this map, the US and Canada and Australia are all green countries, meaning that there's very few people in the population who are truly undernourished. But you look at parts of South America, certainly parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, have significant portions of the population that are undernourished from famine or food shortages. So undernutrition is really a multifactorial problem. It's not just a lack of food or poverty. It's having lots of land that's not fertile, and so you can't grow anything. Or it's having living in places where there are no roads to get the food to the people who live there. There can be war and political problems that blockade people from getting food, disease, parasites, underlying conditions that affect nutrition, and of course overpopulation, having too many people and not enough food to go around. So some of the big diseases of undernutrition are marasmus and kwashiorkor. Marasmus is essentially chronic starvation, not having enough calories to survive, and it causes a wasting away of muscles and other tissues until there's not enough calories to support life and the heart fails. Kwashiorkor is also a disease of undernutrition. It's a lack of calorie intake, but also specifically a lack of protein intake. And it's very common in young children who are weaned from their mother's breast milk. So breast milk is a pretty good source of protein, but usually in these underdeveloped countries, the local diets and the local food does not include a good protein source. It's usually like a watery rice cereal. And so these infants and small children that need a lot of protein to develop are not getting enough. And it causes muscle wasting. It can cause edema, which is swelling from fluid buildup. It can cause a reddening of the hair or lightening of the hair from lack of pigmentation. So also can be fatal if ongoing. Other deficiencies that are problematic worldwide, the three biggest nutrient deficiencies in the world, are iron deficiency, vitamin A deficiency, and iodine deficiency. So iron deficiency is the world's most common nutrient deficiency. It's even common in developed countries like the US, though it's usually more mild than in those underdeveloped countries where it tends to be more fatal. Vitamin A deficiency, again, it does happen mildly in the US. It can cause things like night blindness. Vitamin A is very important for vision in the retina. But if you have prolonged vitamin A deficiency, it can actually progress to total blindness. It also is important for your immune system, so people who are deficient in vitamin A are at increased risk for infections and for mortality that is associated with infections. Iodine deficiency is not common in developed countries because we actually fortify salt. We add iodine to salt, and therefore it's very rare to have iodine deficiency. But in a lot of developing countries, this is not the case. They do not have iodine fortification, and there are two deficiency diseases that result from iodine deficiency. One is swelling of the thyroid gland in the neck, and that's called goiter. And the other happens in pregnant women who are iodine deficient. The fetus doesn't develop properly, and it causes a preventable form of mental retardation in the newborn called cretinism. So in order to prevent these two conditions in the U.S., we fortify our salt with iodine. So that's the end of Chapter 12. Hope this was helpful. Thanks. Bye.